So I've had the ACEMAGICIAN mini PC here for quite a while now. I of course unboxed it, used it, made a few videos out of it already, just because the Ryzen 5 5600U is such an interesting chip, and this was of course one of the cheapest systems on the market that actually had it available. So of course I had to snag this deal, and after using it for all this time, there are some very interesting aspects about it. Certainly there's quite a few things I don't like. One in particular is the construction of the whole system itself. It's made out of some pretty cheap plastic, and the cooling design in general leaves a lot to be desired. The system itself comes with the Ryzen 5 5600U, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a 512 gigabyte SSD. Now, in general, this is pretty decent specs, but one of the biggest limitations is the fact that, unfortunately, the system has a stock TDP of 15 watts. Now, what this ends up doing is it creates a scenario where now 6 cores on the CPU and 7 cores on the GPU have to compete for only 15 watts of power between the two of them. So you end up taking what is essentially a relatively powerful, relatively modern piece of hardware, and you're very much limiting it. Now in the BIOS, you can go in there and actually raise the TDP up to pretty much whatever you want it to be. But what you're going to find is that the chassis itself was pretty much just designed to run this at its stock setting and nothing more than that. At the stock 15 watts, for the most part, using the system on day-to-day tasks, it's perfectly silent, perfectly fine. When you really start to hit it with some demanding tasks that end up utilizing all of the CPU cores or all of the GPU cores, then eventually the fan does kick in, and it is pretty audible, though not to the point where it's horrific. It really only gets horrific once you raise the TDP to anything meaningful, whether it's 20 watts or 25 watts or anything past that. Very quickly, the CPU is going to end up reaching 100 degrees almost immediately, and the fan is going to kick into maximum overdrive and go into full "I'm going to make you deaf" mode. In general, it's just not a pleasant experience. So because it's hard limited really to 15 watts, we'll just take a look at how it performs in a variety of different games at its stock out-of-the-box settings. Now, the first thing that I tested was Cinebench R23. Now, I took a look at it at both configurations. At the stock 15 watt TDP, we ended up getting a score of 7,431, giving it a just slightly under the same result of the Ryzen 5 5560U, but at 25 watts. So at 15 watts, we're certainly not sacrificing too much in terms of the CPU performance relative to the other systems in this price range. But if we raise the TDP up to 25 watts, that's really where you start to see the problems. That's because the TDP of 25 watts ends up giving us a result of 8,716. So while at 15 watts it's very competitive with the Ryzen 5 5500U and the 5560U, you're certainly sacrificing a lot by being limited to just 15 watts. Now, Adobe Premiere, with just a test file that I created with a duration of 7 minutes and 29 seconds, ended up actually taking 22 minutes and 33 seconds to actually end up rendering. Now, this is with Adobe Premiere being updated to support AMD's hardware acceleration, and by all accounts, Adobe Media Encoder was using hardware acceleration here. The results are disappointing to say the least, for sure. I was expecting to see better, but I'm not sure if it's just the fact that it's an AMD iGPU, and even though they're supported, they might just not be optimized to really be used in any meaningful capacity. But in general, at least in terms of the CPU, you are sacrificing quite a bit in terms of the overall multi-core performance. Those single core is still going to be perfectly fine. So for day-to-day tasks, you don't really need to worry, but if you're trying to do some heavier multi-threaded workloads, you're far better off looking at another system. So the first game that I wanted to take a look at was Batman Arkham Knight. Now here you're looking at it running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings. And you could see that on the 5600U, the game is struggling to even give us a 30 FPS average. Immediately immediately what you should be paying attention throughout all of these tests is the GPU clock speed. As you can see, most of the time it's not even reaching its maximum clock speed of 1800 megahertz. Pretty much 15 watts is so little power to really have to split between a GPU with 7 cores and a CPU with 6 cores. And what that fundamentally means is that the vast majority of games are not really going to get you the maximum level of performance unless they're extremely single-threaded. As you can see here with Bioshock Infinite, with the built-in benchmark and the very high graphics preset, for the most part the GPU clock is very close to that 1800 megahertz, though it never really fully hits it, usually being around 25 to 50 megahertz off. That being said though, pay attention to the CPU usage there. It's not even reaching 15% most of the time, which means that the CPU is practically doing nothing, so most of that 15 watts is going to the iGPU, and it's still not enough to let it reach its maximum clock speed. And unfortunately, because of this, even in older titles, it's going to find itself struggling to maintain a good level of performance. Here you can see Borderlands 2 running with a mixture of medium and high graphics settings. We're not able to hit a 60 FPS average, and our 1% lows are unfortunately going below 30. You could certainly get very aggressive with lowering the graphics settings, but for a game that's running on DirectX 9, you would hope for at least some better performance than this. And of course, things do not get better for the third entry in the Borderlands series, where at least before Borderlands 2 could be considered playable. With Borderlands 3, you're pretty much better off dropping the resolution if you actually want to get anywhere near a playable experience. Now, I understand that a lot of people out there can stomach playing games at this low in FPS, but there's just so many good free-to-play games out there that there's really no reason to play a game like this when there's plenty of games out there that you can get an above 60 FPS gaming experience on this exact same hardware. It really seems like AAA games in general, even if they've come out within the last 5 or 6 years, are just not going to be able to do much of anything on here. With Deus Ex Mankind Divided, you can see here that we're really struggling to get much of anything. And of course, even with the CPU just at 30% usage, already that GPU clock speed is getting pretty noticeably far away from the 1800 megahertz max. Of course, even if we were able to reach that maximum clock speed, the performance is still not going to be good here. This is just a especially bad level of performance due to the limitation of the TDP of this specific system. Now, of course, we can raise the TDP, but the temperature becomes just so unbearably high and the system makes so much noise. Really, you're gonna have to stick to some pretty old titles at this point if you want to actually have an enjoyable experience, or you're mostly playing brand new indie games and things like that. But anything that is going to be graphically demanding that came out in the last 6 or 7 years is still going to struggle to give you a good result. But of course, fantastic games like Grid 2 here are going to give you a fantastic experience at the high graphics settings. But as you can see with the Mafia 2 Definitive Edition built-in benchmark, you're looking at more of a 30 FPS average at best in most titles that are more graphically demanding. And again, if you just pay attention to the GPU clock speeds throughout a lot of this, you'll see that the clock speeds that we're reaching are sometimes pretty far from 1800 megahertz, that it's no wonder that we're struggling to get a decent experience here. And you'll notice that most of the time it's the 1% lows that suffer the most. This isn't really that surprising, and you'll see that with even some older titles that just at the time were pretty graphically demanding. It's still not really able to deliver a 60 FPS gaming experience, as you can see here with Metro 2033, the non-Redux version. So this is the original version, and we're still running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we're not able to get a 60 FPS average. Of course, visually speaking, the game does still look pretty damn good. But the same problems carry over to Metro Last Light, again the non-Redux version. And here you'll see that while we're able to still get a playable FPS average, it's certainly nothing remarkable. And our 1% lows definitely leave some to be desired. But it's really the inconsistency in that GPU clock that leads to these large fluctuations with the 1% lows. Of course, once we get to Metro Exodus, you can see that the performance just ends up falling apart here. While a 30 FPS average average might be doable for some people, 1% lows of 18 are pretty abysmal. And for the most part, you're really going to end up finding yourself needing to drop things down to 720p or 900p to get a reasonable experience in a lot of these titles. And that's a fine enough compromise if you really want to actually be able to play on a system like this. It's just unfortunate that this specific system has issues with any kind of raising of the TDP, because there's definitely some performance being left on the table here. Now, Shadow of Mordor does give us a decent enough experience here. Certainly nothing that would be completely unplayable, but as usual, what we're seeing is the 1% lows take the biggest hit here. It's that inconsistency in the GPU clock speed that ends up leading to these large fluctuations when it comes to 1% lows. And really, that's going to be one of the biggest compromises that you're just going to have to make if you're trying to use a system with this low of a TDP as a gaming system. It is the frequent stutters that are going to happen just because the system has to ration the power between a CPU that's trying to do things and a GPU that is also trying to do things. As you can see here, Mountain Blade Bannerlord is pretty much one of the worst case scenarios for the system, since the CPU is seeing some pretty high utilization while also completely relying on the iGPU. So it's no surprise that a lot of the clock speeds that we're reaching on the iGPU are pretty far away from that 1800 megahertz. And of course, there's very frequent stutter throughout all of this that ends up bringing down those 1% lows. Really, what this system ends up being is a better emulation system and a system that is great for games from the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era. Because as you can see here with Resident Evil 5, we're actually able to run the game with the highest in-game graphics settings and 8 times AA. And we're able to get a very playable 51 FPS average with 1% lows of 42, which means it is an overall pretty great result. You're going to get a higher FPS than the PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 ever got at a much higher resolution with much higher graphical quality settings. And as you can see here with Sleeping Dogs running with the medium graphics settings, you're able to get a pretty decently high refresh rate experience in games like this that still end up giving you a better resolution and overall better graphical settings than any consoles that were out at the time that this was relevant. And these are still fantastic games that you can go back and play today. I mean, there's people out there that are playing games that are at this point are 40, 50 years old. I think you can go back and play a game from 10, maybe 15 years ago and be perfectly fine for the most part. But of course, even games that are quite a few years old now are still going to struggle if they were just extremely demanding games, as you can see here with Ghost Recon Wildlands. Not even remotely close to a playable experience here at the full 1080p resolution. But of course, this was a demanding game even back when the iGPU in here was far more relevant. So it's no surprise that it's really going to struggle to keep up after all these years. Now, of course, modern games will run on here perfectly fine as long as they're light enough, as you can see here with Rainbow Six Siege, though it is at this point quite a few years old. It has constantly received updates and even updates to its engine, so it's not the same game that was released all those years ago. But still, we're able to get a more than adequate 1% low and FPS average that I think the vast majority of people would be happy with this result, and considering that this is a system at just 15 watts, it's actually pretty impressive to see. But as I said, you're better off sticking to around the PlayStation 3 or early PlayStation 4 era, as a lot of the titles from that time period, you're actually going to be able to get a pretty decent FPS gaming experience, while also letting you turn up some of the graphics settings that at the time were really only reserved for high-end gaming systems. Of course, very quickly around this time, there was some pretty noticeable graphical leaps in terms of gaming, where you could see how Tomb Raider we could run at the high graphics preset, but now we can't even really play the sequel to it at the lowest in-game graphics settings without having to turn down the resolution from 1080p. And this is just one game from the same franchise. Pretty massive jump in terms of graphical fidelity in general, but of course that is what's making it very difficult for us to even remotely play this game on here, with again the 1% lows being the biggest problem for us. And of course, the trend of heavy older games really suffering continues here with The Division 2 already running at the lowest in-game graphics settings which means that sets the target render resolution to 75%. So we're not even at the full 1080p resolution. And as you can see here, again, the biggest enemy here is the 1% lows. Really drags down the overall experience and just makes this a completely not viable option to play. A 30 FPS average would be at least more passable if our 1% lows were at 30, or at lowest maybe 29. But as it stands right now, this would just be a brutal experience, especially for a title like this where there can be some pretty drastic variance in terms of the level of performance that you're getting while you're actually playing the game. And really, it just seems like Ubisoft games in general seem to dislike these APUs. It seems like their open world nature really does not play well with such a low-end iGPU, especially one that can't even maintain consistent clock speeds. Overall, pretty brutal results to see. Of course, Immortals Fenyx Rising continues this trend of Ubisoft games that really just dislike this APU tremendously, to the point where our 1% lows are at least close to the average, but in general provide a very consistently bad experience. And of course, Assassin's Creed Origins does not buck the trend here. An average being in the mid-20s with 1% lows of 21 at least does show some consistency here, and it does feel far more playable than any of the other Ubisoft games we've seen so far. But that really says more about how bad everything else has been more than how good this really is. And of course, here we have Gears 5 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings and kind of giving a surprisingly decent result. An FPS average of 41 is certainly not remarkable, but the fact that our 1% lows are actually above 30 means that you could more than likely realistically get away with actually playing like this. Of course, this is another one of those titles that has a lot more variance in terms of performance based off of what you're doing. So just because it did this well in the built-in benchmark does not actually mean that the gameplay itself is going to perform better. And what I found was that the 1% lows in particular end up really suffering while playing the actual game. Now, of course, another title that I wanted to check out was Gears Tactics, not because I actually play the game, but because it has a very nice built-in benchmark. We're running this with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but I did leave the textures all set to the highest setting. In general, this was actually a pretty playable level of performance. Within the benchmark itself, everything seemed to work perfectly fine, and while actually playing the game, though I didn't really get that deep into it, I did find the results to be very consistent with what we got with the built-in benchmark. Now, I'm normally a fan of these style of games, but for some reason I still have not really gotten that into this game. I'll probably sink a bit more time into it. I'm a huge fan of the XCOM franchise, so I kind of always just hope that one of these style of games like it end up actually catching my attention, but so far the wait continues. Now, World War Z Aftermath actually ended up giving a decent enough experience, though nothing remarkable. We're looking at about a slightly above 30 FPS average most of the time. Really just depends on the exact level that you're on. With the built-in benchmark, the level of performance was consistent enough, and at least after playing through a few levels, everything seemed to be about the same level of performance, usually the only variance being maybe 2 to 3 FPS at most, depending on the exact map and location that you're in. So we do have that headroom here that in pretty much any scenario you're going to be perfectly fine. And lastly, I wanted to take a look at a game that constantly just surprises me with how good of a job it actually does, and that is Alien Isolation, here running with the ultra in-game graphics settings. And even with this system at a 15-watt TDP, we're actually still getting a very decent FPS average and 1% lows, to the point where you could realistically play like this, especially if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of the graphics settings by going down from ultra down to just high settings. Usually that'll give you a big enough boost that there really isn't any reason to go with ultra, but a surprisingly great result, especially considering just how low a wattage we're using here. Overall, the ACEMAGICIAN is kind of a tough sell at the price point that it's at. The 5600U at 15 watts can be pretty impressive in terms of the CPU performance that it has. It's decent enough GPU performance if you mostly play indie titles or just really light esports games like League of Legends and stuff like that. But the system can be pretty noisy once the fan actually kicks in. To be fair, at the stock 15 watt TDP, it very rarely gets to the point where it needs to turn on the fan, but that also just really depends on where you live and what, if any, kind of air conditioning you're using. If you have no AC and you have a high ambient temperature, what's going to end up happening is this system's going to scream, and what's going to end up happening there is you're going to hate it. At the price point that it's currently at, I would consider going with either the Trig key or any B-Link system in general. This specific case just does not do a good enough job to cool the system.